The photograph should not exist. Prison regulations in 1918 explicitly forbid inmates from possessing personal images. Yet there it was, tucked inside the medical file of prisoner 4782 at Winson Green Women's Prison, a small, faded photograph of a baby's grave. The wardress who discovered it during a routine tuberculosis screening made a note in the margin that would haunt me for years after I found it. Subject became violent when photo confiscated, she wrote in her careful Victorian script. Required restraint by 3 officers, screaming incomprehensible, sedation administered. This was unusual because prisoner 4782, known to the courts as Alice Moore Tatlow, and to the streets as Violet Beardsmore, had never been violent in custody. In 40 years of arrests, spanning 110 court appearances, she had never once raised a hand against authority. Birmingham police knew her for her peculiar compliance, the way she would simply smile and extend her wrists for the handcuffs, as if arrest were an appointment she had been expecting all along. But that photograph of a child's grave had triggered something primal, something the system had never witnessed before. When I discovered that medical file in Birmingham archives 7 years ago, I understood immediately that the real story of Alice Tatlow had been hiding in plain sight for over a century, camouflaged by her own carefully constructed reputation. The official narrative is devastatingly simple. Alice Tatlow was a drunk, a thief, a prostitute, one of Victorian Birmingham's most persistent criminals, who descended from respectable military origins into alcoholism and crime, appearing in magistrates' courts with metronomic regularity for 5 decades. A cautionary tale, a statistic, a complete failure of Victorian morality. But that photograph suggested something else entirely. It suggested grief that was deliberate, preserved, and fiercely protected. Grief requires memory, and memory requires will, and will requires a conscious person behind the performance. I began excavating prison records, medical files, and psychological assessments that had been gathering dust for over a century. What emerged was profoundly disturbing. Alice Tatlow was the most extensively documented criminal woman in Birmingham's history, yet nobody had ever actually documented her as a human being. Every report meticulously describes her actions, her crimes, her sentences, the color of her clothing, the state of her intoxication. But nowhere in hundreds of pages of official records does anyone record what she said when she wasn't performing for the courts. Nowhere does anyone ask her a single question about her interior life, her thoughts, her motivations beyond the obvious. She exists entirely as an object of bureaucratic processing, never as a subject worthy of genuine inquiry. Except once. In 1923, a newly qualified prison psychologist named Dr. Margaret Thornberry was assigned to Winson Green as part of a progressive reform experiment that believed mental evaluation might unlock the mystery of repeat offenders. Alice Tatlow, then 46 years old and serving her 89th conviction, was an obvious candidate for study. Dr. Thornberry's assessment exists in a single water-damaged file at the University of Birmingham Special Collections, donated by her granddaughter in 2011. Most of the document is illegible. The ink bled into abstract, meaningless clouds by decades of moisture. But 3 pages survived intact, and they contain the only recorded exchange with Alice Tatlow that ventures beyond the standard litany of name, address, and plea. What Thornberry documented in those surviving pages would trouble her for the rest of her life. When Alice was asked about the discrepancy between her official records and her actual experiences, she responded with a clarity that caught the young psychologist completely off guard. Every record about me was created by someone who needed me to be a particular kind of person, Alice told her. A particular kind of problem. The army needed my father to have legitimate children, so paper made me legitimate. Birmingham police need repeat offenders to justify their budgets, so paper makes me a repeat offender. Everyone needs me to be simple. The truth is never simple. Thornberry wrote in her final assessment that Alice displayed signs of delusional grandiosity and possible persecution complex, recommending continued observation, but declaring her rehabilitation potential to be nil. The file was archived and forgotten. Thornberry moved to London 6 months later and never worked in prisons again. But in a private letter to her sister, she confessed that the woman in Birmingham still haunted her, that she believed Alice had been trying to communicate something crucial, and that she, Thornberry, had been too confident in her professional training to actually hear it. 70 years after that interview, I think I finally understand what Alice was attempting to convey. She wasn't delusional or grandiose. She was describing a survival strategy so sophisticated that it required everyone around her to fundamentally misunderstand who she was. The question that consumed me became obvious. Why would someone need to disappear while remaining constantly visible? What was Alice Tattelow hiding from? Or perhaps more intriguingly, what was she hiding toward? The answer begins not with her documented birth in India, or her respectable military family, or any of the official starting points that previous researchers have focused on. It begins in a place the Victorian chroniclers deliberately refused to examine: the tattoos covering her body. Prison intake records from 1902 onward describe these marks with clinical precision. Small anchor on left forearm, heart pierced with dagger on right shoulder, initials AMT on left wrist, a rose with thorns encircling right ankle. These were dismissed by authorities as mere prison decoration, the meaningless scribbling of criminal culture. But I spent 3 years consulting with historians of Victorian criminal subculture, with experts in prison tattoo symbolism, with anthropologists who study body modification as communication. What emerged was startling. These weren't random decorations. They were a language, a coded autobiography written on skin for those who knew how to read it. The anchor, contrary to popular assumption about maritime symbolism, was a specific marker in Victorian criminal networks. It indicated someone who had remained silent under interrogation, who had held fast when others broke. The heart pierced with a dagger wasn't a romantic symbol, but a memorial, a permanent mark of personal loss through betrayal. The initials AMT weren't her own initials at all, and this is where the story becomes genuinely disturbing. Historical records of underground criminal organizations from the late 1800s reference a loose network that called itself various names in different cities. But in Birmingham, it was known among its members as the Avenging Martyrs of Treachery. This wasn't a formal gang, but rather a mutual aid society of individuals who had been betrayed by police informants and who dedicated themselves to what they considered restorative justice. The tattoo wasn't decoration. It was a brand of membership, proof of commitment to a code that existed entirely outside legal society. The rose with thorns around her ankle was perhaps the most revealing mark of all. In the symbolic language of Victorian criminal women, this specific image indicated someone who had survived sexual exploitation in childhood. It was both a warning to others and a permanent witness statement written on the body when legal witness statements would never be believed. Alice Tattelow's skin was covered in testimony that the courts would never hear, confessions that the law would never record, membership cards to communities that society refused to acknowledge existed. Every time she was arrested, every time she was processed through the system, officials would dutifully note these marks and understand absolutely nothing about what they were documenting. They were recording a language they couldn't read, preserving evidence they didn't recognize as evidence. This realization transformed everything I thought I understood about Alice's life. The court records show 110 convictions, but they show them as isolated incidents, random acts of drunken impulse by a woman who couldn't control herself. What if they weren't random at all? What if each arrest, each conviction, each carefully timed reappearance in the legal system was actually part of a larger pattern that nobody had bothered to map because everyone had already decided what kind of woman Alice Tatlow was? I began plotting her arrests geographically and chronologically, looking for patterns that previous researchers had missed because they were asking the wrong questions. And there, hidden in plain sight, across decades of bureaucratic records, was something remarkable. Something that suggested Alice Tatlow wasn't a victim of chaos, but rather an architect of her own peculiar form of order. Between 1902 and 1928, Alice Tatlow was arrested in Birmingham on average 4 times per year. Most researchers see chaos in these numbers, the predictable decline of an alcoholic woman spiraling into desperation. But when I mapped these arrests on a timeline, something extraordinary emerged. Her arrests clustered around specific times with mathematical precision: February, May, September, and December. These weren't random binges, they were appointments. She was using the prison system as a hotel, the courts as a calendar, and her notoriety as a passport that guaranteed entry whenever she needed it. Consider the logistics of survival for a woman with no family support, no stable employment, and a reputation that made legitimate work impossible. Winter was lethal for the homeless. But if you could guarantee yourself a 6-week sentence in late November, you would be housed, fed, and kept alive through the worst of winter in a heated cell with regular meals. Alice understood this calculus perfectly. Her December arrests were almost always for minor offenses, carrying predictable short sentences, exactly enough to get arrested, exactly not enough to warrant lengthy imprisonment. When I cross-referenced her arrest locations with Birmingham business directories, another pattern emerged. Her arrests clustered around pawnbrokers, jewelers, and small banks. Not pubs, not lodging houses. Places where money moved through legitimate channels. She wasn't getting arrested near the scenes of her crimes. She was getting arrested near the scenes of someone else's crimes. And I believe she was doing it deliberately. Victorian police operated on a quota system historians rarely discuss. Officers needed certain numbers of arrests monthly to justify their positions. But solving serious crimes was difficult, time-consuming work. What if you were a Birmingham constable facing pressure to show productivity, and you knew Alice Tatlow could be found in certain areas at certain times, would come quietly, serve her time without complaint, and be available again when you needed another easy arrest? Alice wasn't a problem for Birmingham police. She was a solution. She was reliable statistics, and in exchange, she received regular access to institutional shelter and a legitimate explanation for why she kept disappearing from the streets. What if the drunkenness itself was performance? Alice's prison medical examinations tell a surprising story. Her weight remained relatively stable across 3 decades. Her physical health was noted as surprisingly robust for someone of her supposed habits. Yes, she was often described as intoxicated during arrests, but intoxication can be performed convincingly if you understand what police expect to see. Stumbling, slurred speech, emotional volatility are behaviors, not necessarily evidence of actual alcohol consumption. If Alice needed to be arrested, appearing drunk gave police the legal justification they needed, while creating a narrative that explained away inconsistencies. Nobody questions the timeline of a drunk woman. Nobody looks too closely at what she might have been doing before she stumbled into view. The tattoos become even more significant in this context. Women with multiple tattoos were extraordinarily rare in official records. Getting tattooed required access to underground artists, money to pay them, and willingness to endure significant pain for permanent marks that would make you instantly identifiable to police for life. Why would someone trying to avoid police attention deliberately mark themselves in ways that made them unforgettable? Unless being unforgettable was precisely the point. If Alice wanted to maintain a consistent criminal identity that police would recognize immediately, tattoos were the perfect Victorian biometric system. She wasn't marked by the system. She marked herself for the system, ensuring that whenever Alice Tadlow appeared, police would recognize her instantly and process her through the familiar routine. But this strategy only works if there's somewhere else to disappear to. Property records from Warwickshire show that in 1914, a small cottage in the village of Clay was purchased by a woman using the name Violet Morris for £195, an enormous sum for someone supposedly living hand-to-mouth. The timing is significant. 1914 was when Alice's documented arrests suddenly became less frequent for several months, resuming their regular pattern only after the cottage purchase was complete. If Alice maintained a second identity and rural refuge, it would explain persistent mysteries. How did she survive the gaps between arrests? Where did she get money for legal fees? Most intriguingly, how did she remain remarkably literate throughout her life, despite supposedly having no education? Prison records note she could read and write competently, unusual for women of her documented circumstances. Dr. Thornberry described her as articulate and surprisingly well-spoken when she chose to be. These characteristics are maintained through practice, through ongoing engagement with written material, through a life of the mind that existed somewhere the records don't capture. The cipher notebook takes on new significance in this framework. It wasn't delusion or poetry, it was record-keeping. When you maintain two separate lives, when you're managing a decades-long performance that requires perfect consistency, you need a system for tracking details that can't be stored in official records. The cipher wasn't meant to be unbreakable. It was meant to be unreadable to anyone who might casually discover it. I believe that notebook contained Alice's real accounts, the true accounting of her life, the version that existed beneath the performance, written in a code that died with her because she was the only person who needed to read it. This brings us to the photograph of the child's grave that triggered her only recorded violent outburst in 40 years. What if that photograph wasn't someone else's grave, but the grave of Alice's own biological mother or sibling, a piece of identity she'd carried across decades of performance, the one piece of truth she refused to surrender, even when it cost her sedation and restraint. Victorian society created women like Alice by making survival impossible through legitimate means for anyone who fell outside narrow definitions of respectability. A woman with a reputation had virtually no legal employment options, but the same society that closed every legitimate door also created institutions like prisons that paradoxically offered more reliable shelter than anything available to the respectable poor. Alice didn't fail to navigate Victorian society. She succeeded brilliantly by recognizing that the punishment system could be repurposed as a survival system if you understood its rhythms. She turned her criminal record into currency, trading notoriety for predictability in a world where unpredictability was usually fatal for women in her position. Her final recorded court appearance in 1943 shows the same pattern playing out in wartime London. The charge was theft, using a cigarette distraction technique that required manual dexterity unusual for someone supposedly ravaged by decades of alcoholism. When questioned, she provided the same response she'd been giving for 40 years. A simple denial, just enough resistance to maintain the performance. The magistrate sentenced her to a short term. She served it, and then the official record goes silent. No death certificate under her name in Birmingham, no workhouse records. Alice Tatlow simply stopped appearing in the documentary record, and nobody seemed to notice or care. If Alice had maintained that cottage in Warwickshire under an alternate identity, she would have been approximately retirement age by the end of the Second World War. The war had created chaos in British record-keeping. It would have been the perfect moment to let the Alice Tatlow identity die quietly, while Violet Morris lived out her final years in anonymity. Alice had spent 50 years training authorities to see her as simple, predictable, and beneath serious investigation. That perception was her greatest protection. The tragedy is that Alice's story will never be fully known because she designed it that way. Every piece of evidence she left behind was curated to create a specific impression. The cipher notebook that might have contained her true account remains undeciphered. The photograph that clearly held immense personal meaning has been lost to time. Alice achieved exactly what she apparently intended, a life that was simultaneously hyper-visible and completely hidden, documented exhaustively in ways that revealed almost nothing true about her interior experience. We're left with fragments. We know she was born into a military family, probably in India, possibly under irregular circumstances. We know she developed a pattern of regular arrests that continued for nearly 50 years. We know she was literate, articulate, and capable of long-term strategic thinking. We know she marked her body with symbols that meant something to underground networks. We know that a photograph of a child's grave mattered enough that she fought 3 officers for it, the only violence she ever displayed in custody. And we know she disappeared completely from the record in the 1940s, leaving no confirmed death certificate, no grave, no final accounting. The woman Birmingham police called one of their worst characters was actually something far more complex. She was a survivor who recognized that in a society designed to destroy women who fell outside acceptable boundaries, the punishment system itself could be weaponized for survival, if you understood its mechanics, and were willing to pay the social cost of permanent notoriety. Alice wasn't a victim of the system. She learned to play it like an instrument, producing exactly the notes required, while maintaining some other life in the spaces between documented moments. That takes intelligence, discipline, and a form of courage that respectable society has never known how to recognize. If I could ask Alice one question, it would be about the photograph. Who was buried in that grave? What did that image represent that was worth fighting for, when she'd spent decades carefully avoiding any fight that might disrupt her pattern? That photograph was the crack in the performance, the moment when something authentic broke through, and that makes it the most human moment in her entire documented life, the instant when Alice Tatlow stopped being a criminal statistic and became visible as a person carrying grief across decades of performance. We'll never know the answer, that's the point. Alice made certain we would never know. And in that final refusal to be fully known, she maintained her dignity in the only way available to her. She kept her secrets, and in a world that wanted to strip women like her of every shred of privacy and autonomy, that was its own form of victory.